Hey, it's Alicia Kay. Today is a very rainy Wednesday evening as I am filming this, and it's been about 3 years since I was diagnosed with Lyme disease. I have gone back and forth with myself on if I should make a video talking about my Lyme disease, but recently Hank Green made an announcement video that he had cancer, and in that video he talked about how helpful it was to have people sharing their story with him. Now, I'm not trying to compare myself to Hank Green. I'm not trying to compare Lyme disease to cancer, but it was something that I was thinking could have been helpful for me, and I already knew people who had Lyme disease, and still it could have been helpful to hear more stories. So I thought I could make maybe a video for someone that maybe someone will find this who was recently diagnosed or is struggling with Lyme disease and find some solace in not being alone. Also, I thought it could be helpful for me as part of my healing process. So I'll start off with the story of how I got Lyme disease and got diagnosed and all of that. And then I'm going to talk about some of the things that still affect me today from having Lyme disease. 2020 was quite a year for everybody. Everyone knows there was a pandemic. This was also the year that my grandma passed away. So when the pandemic hit, my grandma had just recently passed away, like a month and a half before. So when March hit, everything shut down. My cousin had to fly in from out of the country and didn't have anywhere to stay, so she went to that empty house, and then my husband and I decided to go and join her down in the middle of nowhere, literally the middle of nowhere. This town doesn't even have a stoplight, it doesn't have any services. You have to go to a different town to buy groceries. It's one of those sort of places. So we decided to go down there for the pandemic. So we head down in March, whatever, to work remote and just enjoy a little bit more relaxed during this crazy time. Now, I say more relaxed time because it's such a small town that none of the people there really cared about COVID. We were still doing our best to mask up if we were going to the grocery store, seeing people. But because of just what small towns are sometimes like, where your neighbors are not close, you just have a lot more space to live. And I found it much easier than being my apartment in the city, where if I walked outside, I could run into someone. Down there, I had plenty of space where I felt okay going out because, I had a huge property that was just for me, my husband, and my cousin. We had a huge property that we could go and walk around and not feel worried about running into someone or giving someone COVID or getting COVID. Now, there is a downside to being in a small town that has so much space, and that is critters and creatures. It is something that I think anyone who lives removed from a city understands, is that you have to be very aware of this. And we were doing stuff. It's not like we weren't thinking about critters and creatures, but I wasn't really thinking about ticks. We were talking about mice and spiders. We had the house sprayed, around the outside of the house sprayed to ward off spiders and things like that. We had the lawn sprayed. All the things that my grandma routinely did, we made sure were kept up with while we were there. However, we didn't treat or do anything for ticks because we didn't know they were there. So what happened was I got bit just out on their property in a state where we're not supposed to have Lyme disease in our ticks. I don't live in the Northeast. And during the height of COVID, when my husband first noticed the bite, I will put a picture up here. It was small and very dark, and I kind of thought it was cancer. I thought it was a skin cancer or something like that. Not a serious cancer, because I was 27, pretty young, and I don't have any other risk factors for cancer, but I was like, I have gotten a lot of sunburns. I definitely have skin damage. And even though I am young, I wouldn't be surprised if it was like skin cancer or something like that. And then I did a video chat with a doctor, showed them this very purple mark that showed up very quickly. And they kind of said, you need to come in, get that biopsied pretty quickly, next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It's probably not cancer, but we definitely need to check it out. And was that helpful? Of course. But also with like the quickness, I think anytime in medicine when someone's like, you need to come in, there's like a range, right? Where it's like, if you need to come in today, very serious. You need to come in the next few weeks, you're like, okay, this is still pretty serious. If they're like, oh, schedule an appointment at your convenience, you're like, okay, I need to get it taken care of, but clearly this is not going to have any immediate effects on me, and I don't need to be that worried. So I was kind of sitting in that midpoint, right? So I was starting to get worried, and especially as it started to change. I don't have a ton of great pictures of either of these rashes, but as it started to change and it got bigger and it turned in to the classic bullseye. I will attach the one picture I have, but it became the classic Lyme disease bullseye. And this is when things started to get much more serious for me and much more concerning. Even more serious than like the doctor telling me, oh, you need to come in soon to get this biopsied. Because I knew. Because I had a cousin who had been dealing with Lyme disease, and I had a coworker whose wife also had Lyme disease, and I'd had conversations about it. And I actually sat with one of my other cousins, and she kind of had this spiral almost where she was having a lot of anxiety about Lyme disease, and she was looking at all the symptoms. She had a rash, and she's looking at all the symptoms and all this stuff, and she's like, what if it's Lyme disease, all this. And because I have known the people who've had it, and like this fear that I had seen in people when talking about Lyme disease, I saw that classic bullseye rash, and I was like, I need to be scared now, don't I? So that is when I knew I needed to go to the doctor. I saw this rash, and I was like, I'm going to have to go to the doctor. This was on a Thursday or Friday. I spent kind of the weekend talking about the protests, because it was the same time that George Floyd was murdered. Editing, Alicia popping in real quick to say, I talk about the George Floyd murder and the protests, not necessarily because it has a whole lot of bearing on what I went through, because I didn't go to a protest or anything, I was too sick, but because that's how I anchor myself in time. And I don't feel like I fully clarified that. That's like what my brain always attaches to as like, this is the time period that this was happening in and what was happening around me while I was going through Lyme disease and things like that. So just a point of clarification on that. And deciding if I needed to go back to the city, if I should go back to the city, or if I thought I should just go to kind of like the local hospital that was like 30 minutes away. But I decided to go back to the city. So Monday, and especially because I think over the weekend, I wanted to see if it got smaller, if it got bigger, and it just didn't change. So Monday, nothing's happening. My cousin actually is like trying to we haven't seen the tick head. So that's one thing that like, if you get bit by a tick, you have to make sure it gets out, and sometimes the heads can burrow in. And that never came out of me. Still, like, I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful that I never had that experience. But we're sitting there over the weekend in the midst of everything that's happening in the nation, and then also just like with me, right? And trying to get this tick head out of my leg, and it never comes. And after spending a weekend doing that, I was like, okay, I need to go back to the city I live in. It has more options for medical care, and also I think it's just better for me to return right now. So I went back. And I actually left. I kind of made this decision mid work day. So I messaged my boss and I'm like, hey, I can't actually work the full day today. I need to drive back. She knew I was not in the city. I was like, I need to drive back and get to a doctor because I really need to get tested for Lyme disease. So I did. And I always remember this as happening on a holiday weekend, but I was working, and I don't think I would have been working on a holiday Monday, or my boss wouldn't have been working. My manager wouldn't have been working on a holiday Monday. So I remember it as a holiday weekend, but also the weekend that the protests were happening or starting. I don't know. My memory's fuzzy. I'm sure I could have looked up dates, but I didn't. But I went back to the city. I drove and I went to the hospital. And the reason I remember it being a holiday weekend is because the nurses were so angry with me that I showed up. They were so mad at me. I walk in, I say, I need a Lyme disease test. I have this rash. The nurses are the saltiest people I've ever met in my life. Honestly, I'm sitting there. I'm scared, but managing. I'm like, okay, even if it is Lyme disease, we'll figure this out. I know people who have Lyme disease. I have a cousin who has Lyme disease. And this is what's going on in my brain, right? I'm like, it'll be okay. We'll figure it out. Also, the test hasn't come back yet. And it's really rare. But I was pretty certain it was Lyme. But the nurses didn't want me there. They asked me what I was doing there. They asked me why I had to come in. They were so rude. And I had to just be like, no, give me this test. I need you to give me this test. And then the doctor came in and said, are you sure it's not a mosquito bite? We've only had one case of Lyme disease in this state, which is false. We've had more. But she said we'd only ever had one case of Lyme disease in this state. And just complete misinformation that she was then telling me. And essentially what I was being told is you shouldn't be here. But I said, give me this test and then I'll leave. Basically. So they gave me the test. They pulled my blood. And they're like, we'll call you with results. So a few days pass and the call comes. And before I pick up, I know. I'm like, they're going to tell me it's Lyme disease. So I pick up the call, and the thing that really irritates me, there's a lot of things that irritate me about this story and how the medical system works in America. I mean, the fact that I had to be like, look, I have the classic bullseye rash, and you still don't want me to get this test because you think this is just a mosquito bite, even though I know this is not what my body does for mosquito bites. And this is textbook Lyme disease. They didn't want to give it to me. But one thing that irritated me was the diagnosis wasn't actually really a diagnosis. So when I said it's been 3 years since I got diagnosed, how I found out I had Lyme disease was I got a call and they said, okay, your prescription for doxycycline is filled. You'll need to take it for 2 weeks. I don't think they even said the word Lyme disease or the phrase at all. There wasn't someone who said, okay, we got your test results back and you have Lyme disease. I think maybe they said we got your test results back. I don't remember everything they said. It has been 3 years, and Lyme disease brain, it's fun. But they didn't say you have Lyme disease. Those words never came out of their mouth. I knew I had Lyme disease because I was prescribed the medication to treat Lyme disease. So after that phone call came, I went, picked up my medication, picked up my antibiotics, Not antibiotics. Oh no, what are they called? No, yeah, antibiotics. I went and picked up my prescription. I think it was antibiotics. It was doxycycline, and took that for 2 weeks. And it sucked. It was awful. They wrecked me. Between the Lyme disease and that medication, like the Lyme disease was already affecting me. Before I went and picked up my medication, I was having trouble. And then between that Lyme disease and the medication, my body was wrecked. Like completely destroyed. For example, I used a Costco pharmacy, and as I was walking through Costco, we were like, oh, we'll pick up a couple other things while we're here since we need a couple other things. One of them was olive oil. So we're walking to go pick up the olive oil, and my husband goes, okay, we're gonna go pick up the olive oil. I'm like, okay. We walk like 10 steps, and I'm like, what are we getting? And he says, olive oil. So I'm like, okay. And I'm like, oh yeah, we're getting, what is it? And he reminds me, olive oil. And this happens like 3-4 times that he has to, within the span of 5 minutes, that he has to remind me the word for olive oil. I have always had a bad long-term memory, but a pretty good short-term recall. And I had never ever before had issues with remembering words. And it was all of the sudden that I couldn't remember things. And honestly, I still can't. I'll talk more about like the long-term effects, but it has been really hard to go from, and overnight pretty much, to go from remembering words pretty well and feeling like I'm pretty well spoken and pretty confident in how I speak to, you know, what I am and what I am now, having a hard time remembering words, and also like stumbling over my words a lot more. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but the transition has been hard. And like knowing that I was a different way before than I am now has been hard. So we got the prescription. I was on antibiotics for 2 weeks. Now, this was fine. This ended up being fine for me. The long story short of this is that ended up working for me, and the Lyme disease is gone. Maybe. The Lyme disease is gone. I've gotten multiple blood tests that have said there's no more Lyme in my body. This 2 weeks of antibiotics worked. Now, you're supposed to, I think, be getting like a month to 6 weeks of antibiotics. That is normally what's prescribed for Lyme disease. And it is actually very rare that 2 weeks would knock it out. So in that case, I got very lucky. But those 2 weeks were still terrible. I didn't take the full 2 weeks off work, and I kick myself for that frequently because I was in probably the worst pain I've ever been in my life, or if not very close to the worst pain I've ever been in my life. I couldn't really take painkillers because they were contraindicated with the medicine I was taking. I think there was some I could take, but again, I didn't know which ones those were because the communication from the healthcare professionals I had been working with up until that point had been so terrible that even though they told me, they didn't give me any written information or any help in that way to help me remember. So I didn't remember. And I knew that like most of them were contraindicated. So I just didn't really take any pain medicine. And then I was also so dizzy and I could barely move. Like I had a hard time getting up to go to the bathroom by myself. And I had to leave all the lights off in my apartment. Like it was a really, really miserable time to be on those antibiotics and with Lyme disease. And even having a really miserable time, I still know it could have been worse because that could have lasted longer. Or, right, there's like a whole myriad of things that could have happened. And I'm sure I'm missing something. But what I did was I just sat on the couch. I couldn't look at anything. And I couldn't even really sit up. I was like, I had these plans. I was like, okay, well, I'll do a puzzle or I'll play video games. Because those are very low energy. But I couldn't. The only thing, I mean, I made myself work. That's the only thing I like made myself do. And I honestly really regret that. But I was worried about money, of course. And I didn't have like PTO because of how I was working. I was technically working full time, but without any of the full-time benefits because I was technically still a part-time employee since I was just working full-time for the summer and would go back to my part-time hours over the school year. So I didn't really have much, if any, PTO. So the only thing I made myself do was work. I wouldn't even go out and get groceries. That's the only time during the whole pandemic that I didn't go out and get groceries myself. Because at least during the rest of the time, that was something I could go do, right? And like I could do it safely. And I couldn't do anything. I sat on the couch with a pillow over my head and listened to audiobooks. And that's the only thing I really felt like I could do. I tried to go on walks, and sometimes I was successful, and sometimes I was too dizzy to stand up. Like I said, like some days I couldn't get to the bathroom without help. And like there's a couple moments that stand out really clearly for me, and one of them was actually laying in the tub in my bathroom with all the lights off because there was no windows, so it was the darkest room in the house. Just laying in the bottom of the tub with the most painful migraine I've ever had in my life. And I thought in that moment, like, if at least everything I face from now on is less painful than this, I'll probably be okay. Because I was in so much pain. But in the end, the medicine worked. And I am free of Lyme disease, I think. I always hesitate to say that. And maybe now I can add the disclaimer that I probably should have had at the beginning, that I'm not a doctor. And even though I was doing pre-nursing stuff before, I am not now. I am not giving medical advice. I'm just talking about my experience and my feelings. And one of my feelings is every time I talk about Lyme disease, even though the tests say it's out of my body, I am so hesitant to trust the doctors who tell me this and to trust the tests because of how thoroughly mishandled, I want to say, my situation was. Like, from the beginning, they told me I didn't need to be at the doctor and that I didn't need to get a test. And because of how this was handled, I now have a really hard time believing the Lyme disease is gone. And I'm still, like, not really over it in my body. I'm definitely not over it in my heart and my soul and my mind. Right? So, it's been 3 years. And I have PTSD from this situation. And every time I talk about Lyme disease, I get kind of paranoid, and I don't use these words lightly. Like, I've talked about this in therapy. I don't use these words lightly. I feel crazy. Like, legitimately, I feel paranoid and crazy when I talk about Lyme disease, and the feeling of anxiety and like the tension that arises in my body is different from any of the other mental health challenges I have had. It's a different experience. And like I said, I have talked about this in therapy, and this is one of the long-term effects of both how I was treated by this system and also the Lyme disease, right? One of the side effects that I read about with Lyme disease is increased paranoia. And now, with being 3 years out from Lyme disease and even making this video, I can't talk about it for this long without feeling paranoid and like I am going crazy. In this moment, I feel a little bit like I'm going crazy. And like I said, part of that could be the system, but part of that is, from what I understand, just what Lyme disease does to you, even 3 years later. Even though it's gone, I can't bring myself quite to believe that. Now, I am lucky that I have been able to regain and get to, I think I'm in a pretty good spot right now. I am in a spot where I'm rebuilding strength and getting back to like a more normal life, but like Lyme disease wrecked my body and it has taken 3 years to feel like I'm in the spot where I'm at, which is a pretty good spot, even with all of the side effects I still have. So for me, the side effects 3 years on, and with the Lyme disease out of my system, I feel like I fatigue a lot easier than I used to. I mentioned earlier, like the memory issues. And I'm sure like there's a lot of things that happen that I honestly can't even like think of all the moments because my memory is not the greatest. But I can't even think of all the moments where I will say things like, oh, this feels like a Lyme disease thing. The PTSD and the memory for me and the fatigue have been like the three biggest ones. There's probably other little things, but for me, those are the three things that are the biggest. And the fatigue, I think I'm getting over. And especially as I work on my anxiety and depression that are like separate from Lyme disease, the fatigue has gotten a lot better. So there's like this intermix of like, I got Lyme disease, which wrecked my body. I lost so much strength and muscle tone over the 2 weeks that I was out, and then the symptoms from Lyme disease carry on for a while. And this actually was told to me by my doctor, that the symptoms of Lyme disease carry on for a while after, and even after it's out of your blood. So as I get further away and as I deal with my mental health issues and as I build up and have built up more strength that I lost on Lyme from having Lyme disease, and then also have taken so long to build back because of such long-term effects from Lyme disease that have made it really hard to build it back, that now I'm here and I'm doing a little bit better. And that's kind of like moved to the bottom of the list of concerns, right? The fatigue isn't as bad as it used to be because I've been able to mitigate it in other ways, and I'm finally starting to see almost like a pre-Lyme disease me in that regard. With these other two main long-term side effects, the memory and the PTSD, I don't feel like they're getting better, and I don't know how long it will take for them to get better. If they ever will, honestly. Like, I feel fundamentally and permanently changed by Lyme disease. And I think I have been. Like, I think that is a true thing. I think I was fundamentally and permanently changed. And I think I am lucky in my situation that it wasn't worse than it could have been. And that's something I think about a lot, is it could have been a lot worse. And I know potentially maybe for some of you watching this, like, it is worse. It is more long-term. Things are worse. And I reach out with sympathy, and I'm here for you if you found this and you're having a really hard time. There can be light at the end of the tunnel. Luckily for me, the antibiotics worked. I know for not everyone they did. But also, I had a huge breakthrough recently with fatigue and things like that, and just like a general outlook on life through something that I put in kind of like in between traditional and non-traditional medicine, which is I did ketamine treatments, and I'm probably going to make a video all about that. But that also really, I think, has helped me with some of the side effects that I was facing from Lyme disease. The doctors and this medicine couldn't do it all, right? I had to go and do a lot of this myself and look for other ways. And one huge thing that I did that really helped me, at least emotionally, when I was in the depths of Lyme disease, is I ate whatever the hell I wanted. I didn't care. I ate what I craved, and that has always kind of a little bit been how I eat, but to the nth degree when I had Lyme disease. Like, I was like, I'm craving peas, so I ate peas. And one day I was craving peas, and I was craving peas so bad that I ate a whole steamable bag of peas in one sitting. And someone made fun of me for it, but that is just what my body was craving and what my body needed. And I gave it to my body. I did it. And that's like the one thing that I look back on with the most like that's, I think, the thing I did that was the best for myself when I was going through that process, was I really listened to what I needed in that way. There's always a question for me of like, where do I go from here with the Lyme? Am I ever going to feel like I truly did pre-Lyme disease? Do I even truly remember at this point what I felt like pre-Lyme disease? I mean, I know I wasn't having these memory issues, but there is always in the back of my mind, is it going to come back? That is always there. Is always there for me. And I think about it all the time. I think about Lyme disease probably every day. And I, scare people isn't the right word, but I definitely make people uncomfortable sometimes when I will just casually be like, oh yeah, when I had Lyme disease, whatever. And they're like, it's the underrated joy of like having something like Lyme disease when you're kind of reaching to the other side. When, I am mostly on the other side of Lyme disease. I'm not where I was pre-Lyme disease, but I can function pretty well, right? Like, I can do all the things I need to do. I think I'm a little slower than I used to be, and I've always just generally been a slower person. But I'm living my life. And I'm not the kind of person that people don't look at me, not that there's a stereotype for Lyme disease, but because I'm able to go and do work and school and whatever, when I say, oh, I had Lyme disease and the state I live in, it startles people. And that's kind of like the underrated joy of it, is like this moment of, oh, what do I say? What do I do? And I take joy and pleasure in that, because this road has been hard. And I'm going to enjoy that. Because I find it enjoyable, I'm going to enjoy it. You might also be saying to yourself, Alicia, these long side effects also sound like long COVID, which is something I've heard a lot. That's something actually my mom says to me frequently. She's like, are you sure it's not long COVID? And I guess I can't be 100% sure, but I'm like pretty sure it's not long COVID for a few reasons. The first of which being, I was never diagnosed with COVID. I never had a positive COVID test. I'm not going to say I never got COVID, because I know asymptomatic COVID is a thing. And so it is possible that I got that at some point. However, what I will say is every time I started to feel an inkling of sickness, I took a COVID test. None of those ever came back positive. And then also, when I was going back to school in person, I was COVID testing multiple times a week, just no matter how I felt. And none of those ever came back positive either. So the reason I'm pretty sure it's not long COVID is I was actually diagnosed with Lyme disease. These are all also things that can happen with Lyme disease. I know they can happen with long COVID, but they can also happen with Lyme disease. And that's the diagnosis I actually got in 2020. So I'm pretty sure that's what it is. And I know, like, all of the people I know who've had Lyme disease, the handful of people I know, it's been a much longer road for them. They didn't do 2 weeks of antibiotics and then have the Lyme disease leave their system. It's been years. That is what I was expecting for myself when I found out I had Lyme disease too. I was expecting years and years of being so sick I can't stand, being unable to work, having to spend most of my days with the lights off, listening to an audiobook with a pillow over my head. That is what I expected. And I think that is very much a reality with some people with Lyme disease. But it ended up not being my reality. And it is completely possible that there are other people out there who are being diagnosed with Lyme disease or in treatment, that isn't your reality either. But also it could be. And honestly, either way, it's going to be hard. I will say I do think one of those roads is harder than the other, right? There's the years versus like a little bit of time. Like I said, I think I got lucky, but it still was a pretty isolating, lonely journey. And the best solace I did find was when I was able to like talk to my cousin or my coworker whose wife has been dealing with Lyme disease for a long time. My coworker at the time, and I was able to talk to him about, what her life was like. Those were the most comforting moments. Other than that, was a pretty lonely journey. That's one thing I think is like being sick, whatever kind of sickness, can be very lonely. And I hope if anyone out there is dealing with sickness like this, maybe this can help you feel a little bit less lonely. That is my Lyme disease story. Leave me a sunflower down in the comments, all of you who have made it this far in the video. And also, if you are recently diagnosed with Lyme disease, are currently going through the process of trying to treat Lyme disease, or have had Lyme disease for a long time, whatever kind of situation you're in with Lyme disease, if you've been diagnosed, let's talk. There's not a whole lot of people around me physically who have been through something like this, at least with Lyme disease where I am, because there's not a lot of Lyme disease in my state. So I would love to chat with some other people, and especially if you live in a state like mine where there's also not a lot of people who've had Lyme disease like in your physical location. Maybe we can create a little conversation down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it intriguing or were able to find community and solace in this. And I hope to see you in my next one. Bye.